Mr. Lowcock, welcome. It's a pleasure having you here at the Graduate Institute, and we thank you for your availability and your time. We'll look forward to hearing from you on this most important of issues, on this most important of unfortunate anniversaries.
Well, Mahmoud, thank you very much indeed. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. No crisis has absorbed more money and effort from humanitarian agencies than the tragedy of Syria. So the question I'm addressing today is, what has the humanitarian system learned from the experience, and how is it reshaping the work of humanitarian agencies? I'm going to spend a few minutes just reminding everybody of what's happened over the last 10 years, because there's been a series of phases, and I think it's helpful to remind ourselves exactly how things have played out. But I'm going to spend most of the time trying to distill some implications, lessons, takeaways, if you like. Now, as you'll recall, everything started with protests as part of the wider Arab Spring in Daraa. What happened in Syria was that the protests were greeted by the government with beatings and bullets, and that in turn led the opposition to take up arms, and that's how unrest turned into civil war. And it's important to note that the international community's stake in Syria from the outset stacked up differently than in other countries affected by the Arab Spring. In particular, the Russian Federation had long held a naval facility in Tartus. The Assad family had sustained an intimate long-term alliance with Iran, so both Russia and Iran had important stakes in the survival of the Syrian government. And meanwhile, other key powers, including the US and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and other Gulf states, clearly hoped that the Arab Spring might topple President Assad and open up the space for a government more aligned with their interests. So from the very outset, the conflict was internationalized. The UN appointed a diplomatic envoy in February 2012. That was Kofi Annan, who you all remember. But his efforts were undermined really from the outset by the growing acrimony among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, arising from the NATO intervention in Libya. The intervention in Libya fueled fears, I think, in Moscow and Beijing that any invocation by the Security Council of Chapter 7 measures, which is the part of the UN Charter which allows for enforcement action in Syria, even in the form of non-military measures like sanctions, would be the start of a slippery slope towards regime change. And so the Security Council was unable to agree any of those measures. In fact, there were multiple vetoes, 15 or 16 vetoes by Russia in the Security Council. In many cases, they were joined by China. 3/4 of the vetoes exercised in the Council over the past 10 years have been on Syria, in fact. So Kofi wasn't able to get any real buy-in beyond rhetorical support for his diplomatic initiative, and he ended up stepping down in July 2012 out of frustration. One thing that meant was an increasing onus on humanitarian organizations to deal with the consequences. And that failure of politics also set the scene for a dramatic increase in the scale, intensity, and brutality of the fighting between mid-2012 and September 2015. And that escalation was basically driven by 3 factors, I think. Firstly, Assad's realization, in the light of recurrent Russian vetoes in the Security Council, that the risk of finding himself held accountable for his actions was limited. And that essentially opened up the way for the decision he took to use chemical weapons against the opposition. Initially, the US administration, the Obama administration, had said that was a red line for them, but that red line wasn't enforced, and Assad accordingly knew he'd been let off the hook, essentially. The second factor, I think, fueling escalation was the increase in military and financial support from fighting parties from those outside. That included Iran and Hezbollah, who had boots on the ground, but also a wide variety of other actors. And those other actors were reflected in the emergence of really a huge number of opposition groups. At one point in this period, we in the UN counted more than 1,500 separate groups, all with constantly shifting agendas and alliances and backers. Now, the more moderate groups failed to unify, but others, like Islamic State, were able to establish a strong foothold. And before long, Syria became the global center, really, for jihadi militancy. I'm going to come back to ISIS, who committed some of the most heinous crimes of the conflict. But the effect of this fragmentation and multiplicity of groups at this time was that the situation on the ground was extremely chaotic. By September 2013, government forces controlled only 30% of Syrian territory, and much of the rest was under the sway of this plethora of other armed groups. And one of the consequences of all that was a mushrooming humanitarian tragedy. Number of refugees during this period grew 50-fold to more than 3 million. And at the same time, there was a 25-fold increase in internally displaced people. By 2015, more than half the Syrian population were no longer living in their pre-war homes. The fact that the Syrian government no longer controlled most of the country's territory, and combined with its refusal to allow the UN's Damascus-based aid operation to deliver aid across front lines to opposition areas, led to the Security Council in 2014 passing a resolution permitting the UN to carry out cross-border aid operations, and I'll come back to that as well. Over the summer of 2015, the refugee issue assumed much greater prominence, especially in Europe. And in the face of all these developments, the international response to the crisis by late 2015 basically shifted from resolution of the conflict to mitigating its fallout. So the policy focus was basically around 3 things on which there was a degree of unity among the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So those 3 things were chemical weapons, terrorism, and humanitarian assistance. Then there was a phase from really late 2015 to mid-2018 when the government, with the assistance of Russian military forces who formally intervened on the ground, established control over much of central and southern Syria, and a coalition led by the US waged its struggle to deal with ISIS. And I'm going to say a bit more about both those things. The tactic of choice adopted by the government of Syria and its allies to regain ground was siege warfare of the sort characteristic during the medieval period. By the end of 2016, there was something like 1 million Syrians living in areas besieged by their own government. And basically what happened was the government would use sieges in combination with indiscriminate aerial bombardments to coerce dozens of communities into surrender agreements. They were characterized as starve or surrender tactics. And through those processes, the government was able to establish control of much of the country, often by sending the final remnants of opposition in those sieged areas to the northwest of Syria, to Idlib, and sometimes to the northeast. And that had later consequences, as we'll see. Meanwhile, as I said, the US-led coalition with ground troops from Kurdish militias were increasingly successful in displacing ISIS from northern Syria, and that culminated in late 2017 in the liberation of Raqqa. The byproduct of that, though, was a complete destruction of Raqqa and displacement of tens of thousands of more people. Now we move on now essentially to the second half of 2018 and the period after that. That was a period which was more peaceful across most of the country, but there was still an ongoing struggle, mostly between Syria and Russia on the one hand, and Turkey on the other, over the control of the 2 main areas that remained outside government control at that point, namely Idlib and the surrounding areas in the northwest and the Kurdish-dominated areas of the northeast. In the case of Idlib, Turkey and Russia had agreed essentially a buffer zone would be established when they met in Sochi in September 2018. But despite that agreement, Syrian and Russian forces renewed their offensive in 2019, and that led to a military escalation in 2019 up to March 2020 that saw, in fact, some of the most intense fighting in the whole of the decade of conflict. That also, by the way, directly pitted the forces of a NATO member, Turkey, against Russia. Finally, in March 2020, there was another ceasefire agreement affecting the northwest, and that continues to hold, opposition forces continue with Turkish backing to control territory populated by over 4 million people in the northwest, although the situation is still quite fragile. Through these 5 years or so, from 2015 onwards, collaboration among key powers on humanitarian issues was increasingly eroded. And that was reflected in December 2019 and July 2020, when the Security Council, faced with Russian and Chinese vetoes, consecutively reduced the scale of the UN's cross-border operation. So that brings us now to the situation we now see. Syria is currently a picture of economic despair, heightened humanitarian needs. The economy is less than a third of its pre-war size, maybe much smaller than that. The Lebanese financial crisis has pulled Syria down too, with the collapse of the value of the Syrian pound. Food prices have gone through the roof. On top of all that, we had, of course, COVID-19, and some, like the US, have continued to tighten their sanctions. Now, I'm going to move on to the lessons of all this for humanitarian agencies now, but I do just want to pause for a moment and recall, as Mahmoud did at the beginning, what the human cost of all this was. More than 500,000 Syrians probably have died in the war. The UN actually stopped counting. We found it impossible to keep track some years ago, but those are the estimates. Another 1.5 to 2 million living with permanent disabilities. The world's largest displacement crisis, all those refugees and displaced people since the Second World War. And, you know, it's easy to be trapped by the numbers, but the numbers all represent individual people. And on my visits to Syria and surrounding countries in the year, I met many Syrians who told me what had happened to them. And the level of trauma and the scale of suffering is really mind-boggling. People frequently weep and shake as they tell their stories. They're unable to recover from their trauma, and they're still terrified for what lies ahead. And we can talk more in the discussion about some of the people I've met, if you like, and what they want and what they've said. I think their voices are not heard enough. But here are the 7 main conclusions I draw from all this for humanitarian agencies. And I offer these points in a spirit of humility. They arise amidst terrible tragedy. The lesson learning is not complete. There needs to be more evaluation, and we don't know what the future holds. But I do think it's important to try to take stock. Now, the first thing on the list is that despite all the challenges, humanitarian agencies have been able to save hundreds of thousands of lives by bringing aid to people in severe need. The UN, in retrospect, we were a bit slow in 2011, 2012 to get going with the humanitarian operation, but we did quickly build up what's become a major operation, both trying to support refugees in neighboring countries and trying to support Syrians in government-controlled areas and in opposition-controlled areas. And things would certainly have been a lot worse but for that huge effort. It's important to say also that most of the people who worked on humanitarian operations inside Syria are Syrians themselves. Syrian aid workers have paid an outsized price in terms of blood and lives. More than 250 of them have been killed doing their jobs over the last 2 years. Many of their heroic endeavors have been captured, including in documentary movies like the Oscar-nominated The Cave. I know at the Graduate Institute there was a screening of The Cave about a year ago, and probably some of you, like I, had a chance to meet the heroine of that story, Dr. Amani Balur. She's a very gentle, softly spoken pediatrician, and she is characteristic really of huge courage and determination to relieve suffering many aid workers displayed. So notwithstanding all the savagery, there have been acts of humanity on a vast scale, and much of it has been done by Syrians, often through newly created organizations. The second lesson I draw is that the Syria crisis exemplifies the challenges humanitarian organizations face in today's geopolitical realities. You know, we've got more explicit rivalry among the leading powers and greater willingness of others to intervene militarily, often through proxies, in regional issues. And that's created basically a greater politicization of the humanitarian realm. And that forces humanitarian organizations to engage much more actively in the political arena. And we can decry this all we want. We can invoke the humanitarian principles of neutrality and independence and impartiality all day long, but we still have to deal with the reality of what I've just said. It's a highly politicized environment. A number of key powers try to instrumentalize humanitarian action for their political and other goals. Syria's allies wanted to ensure humanitarian support reinforced the government's sovereignty and state control. Conversely, the people paying for the humanitarian relief operation, in other words, paying for most of what humanitarian agencies have done, and they've been largely Western countries, have often harbored a sympathy for the protesters and the moderate opposition. And what this means is humanitarian organizations and leaders, for all the frustrations it involves, inevitably get drawn into the political sphere. And I know something about that myself, because I spent more than 30 mornings or afternoons during my tenure in this job in often unproductive meetings on Syria in the Security Council. So recognizing this is politicized and there's no choice but to engage with that is something that humanitarian agencies need to reflect on. The third takeaway is that we need a more honest and nuanced debate about the difficult trade-offs humanitarian agencies face when trying to save lives in a context like Syria. And those trade-offs result from a basic dilemma. On the one hand, humanitarian action anywhere requires the consent of whoever in practice is in control of the relevant territory. Humanitarian agencies can never force their way in. For the UN, the provision of humanitarian assistance also requires the consent of the affected country, or if that country's government is not in control of all its territory, permission from a Security Council resolution where that is available. But on the other hand, in the case of Syria, the government has tried not only to manipulate humanitarian aid at every turn, but it's also been responsible for the lion's share of the atrocities committed during the war. And that dilemma has made the engagement of humanitarian agencies in Syria a perennial walk on an ethical tightrope. And agencies, including my own office, have taken quite a bit of flack from some human rights NGOs and others for the compromises that they say that's forced us into, for, as those organizations see it, having been too accommodating to Damascus, for allowing the government, as they see it, to rig humanitarian assistance in return for access, and, as some of them say, for sacrificing humanitarian principles on the altar of consent. Now, I think elements of this criticism disregard some basic realities, but I do want to engage with it because it is important to have an honest debate about it. Yes, it's true that humanitarian agencies accepted a greater degree of intrusion by the Syrian government than in other conflict zones. Yes, it was agreed that a national organization, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, would oversee much of the distribution of aid. And yes, aid agencies never threatened to pull out over countless restrictions and hurdles that were put in their way. But the tendency of humanitarian agencies to err on the side of providing assistance was based on a few basic truths. Saving hundreds of thousands of lives through the provision of assistance outweighed the damage done by accommodating government restrictions. And there is zero indication that humanitarian agencies would have gained any leverage on the Syrian government by withholding assistance or suspending operations. Moreover, those financing the operation, primarily Western donors, wanted it to be sustained despite the difficulties and the dilemmas. So what this boils down to is the hard truth that humanitarian agencies can only do what decision makers in control of those places where civilians in need of assistance live will let them do, and what other people are willing to pay for. The fourth point, in a way, comes from the opposite end of the spectrum. The emergence of extremist groups who don't even pretend to subscribe to the basic norms of humanitarian action and who regard aid workers as legitimate targets of attack has major implications for established humanitarian agencies, which we have yet to find a way of handling adequately. areas controlled by ISIS, for example, often became no-go areas for humanitarian agencies. There have been few exceptions where humanitarian agencies were able to deliver help in places controlled by ISIS. One that was possible was a large-scale polio vaccination campaign in eastern Syria in 2016 to 2018, and there was some engagement from third parties which helped with that. But one thing we do need to do into the future is find better solutions to this challenge of accessing populations in places controlled by extremist groups, because there's now something like 60 million people, nearly 1% of the global population, who live in places under the control of non-state armed groups, and many of them are extremists. So we need to find ways to engage better with that. My fifth conclusion then relates to the UN's particularly important responsibility to try to protect the innocent against atrocities and other abuses. There's been no other crisis over the past 30 years that has been as challenging and disheartening as in Syria on that score. The level of brutality and taboo breaking over the course of the past decade has no recent parallel, and that tells us something about wider erosion of respect for humanitarian norms. On a personal level, I have to say what I found particularly hard to stomach were the systematic attacks on medical facilities. The World Health Organization counted 250 of those attacks just between 2018 and 2020. Something like 1,000 healthcare workers were killed over the past decade, as well as being acts of pure cruelty. These attacks also lastingly devastated the Syrian health system. I and my predecessors in this job regularly appeared before the Security Council to call out these violations and plead on behalf of people trapped in the fighting. And, you know, it was curious sometimes to see speakers in the Security Council seeking to deny the facts of what was happening with these violations. A huge amount of real-time footage of indiscriminate attacks that Syrian activists and citizens and international groups that supported them posted on YouTube and Twitter and elsewhere made those denials a subject of considerable ridicule. As the war escalated from 2013 onwards, we also got increasingly worried about threats not just to civilians, but to aid workers on the ground. In 2014, we'd established a humanitarian deconfliction mechanism under which the UN gave the US and Russia and Turkey details of all planned convoys and the coordinates of humanitarian sites, with the idea that they would then be protected. And for a while, that system actually worked quite well. But unfortunately, it became increasingly obvious from 2018 onwards that the government of Syria and some of its allies no longer brought into the deconfliction arrangements. In 2018, more aid workers were killed in a single year in Syria than in any other conflict over the previous 20 years. And the government of Syria openly, transparently took the view that there was nothing in the areas that they didn't control which was not a legitimate target. Their view, and they wrote to the Security Council to say this in plain terms, was that it was acceptable to hit every single target in parts of Syria they didn't control because they asserted those targets were used by terrorists. In our estimation, there were 100 civilians for every terrorist in Idlib. And essentially what the Syrian authorities were doing was stripping the core international humanitarian law principle of proportionality of any meaning at all. So I came to the conclusion that deconfliction wasn't working. We began to advise humanitarian organizations on the ground about the risks of continuing to provide information on where they were operating. And I'm afraid the subsequent evidence suggests those concerns were right. The New York Times in May 2019 published a list of 182, in October 2019 they published this, a list of 182 deconflicted sites, of which 27 had been damaged by Russian or Syrian attacks over the previous 6 months. And all of those sites were hospitals or clinics. 10 members of the Security Council asked us to set up a board of inquiry to investigate some of those cases, and that board of inquiry, which is an independent group of people, concluded it was highly probable that most of the attacks were attributable to the government of Syria or its allies. Now, the issue is how do you pursue advocacy in those circumstances? We didn't have a deconfliction system that was working anymore. We faced the deepening battles over truth with the thickening fog of information warfare. The facts we provided were sometimes falsely dismissed as fake news, but we took the view that it was important to sustain the advocacy. Ultimately, facts do tend to prevail. There's an ever greater premium on our ability to gather and assess and present truthful information. And that's important really for the simple reason that it reinforces the validity of the basic norms of how people are supposed to behave in conflict. And however much they dodge and weave, no one in fact likes to be shamed on the world stage for grave violations. One good thing is there's huge amounts of evidence. And one question is how that evidence is going to be used. There's no agreement in the UN about having international processes, but there are, interestingly, some national processes that are already underway. Many of those cases, in fact, are in Germany, including a trial which started in April last year against Anwar Raslan, the head of the investigations unit at a notorious torture prison in Damascus, and one of his aides, Iyad al-Gharib. In fact, the German ambassador to the Security Council relayed a lot of the evidence that was presented in that case to members of the Security Council. And one of the defendants, in fact, has been was convicted in February, and the verdict for the other main defendant is expected to be issued later this year. This issue of accountability is super important because unless there's accountability, miscreants will draw the lesson that serious crime pays and what's not punished is incentivized. I've got two more quick points, Mahmoud, and then I'll wrap up. The sixth point is about what we've learned from the experience of raising huge amounts of money for the relief operation. We've raised between 2013 and 2019 something like $30 billion. That amounts, in fact, to a third of the global humanitarian funding the UN has managed over that period. 2/3 of all that money come from the US, Germany, the UK, and the European Commission, and a group of other Western countries account for another 21%. Some other countries who might be expected to share some of the financial burden in light both of their means and their political responsibilities for Syria, including, I have to say, 3 of the permanent members of the Security Council, as well as Saudi Arabia, are, though, conspicuously absent from the list of significant donors. So why have we been able to raise money on that scale? Well, I think there's 3 factors. I mean, the first is, and this is thanks to the courage and determination and grit of Syrian and Western journalists, Syria consistently featured prominently in the news headlines in donor countries, reminding everyone of the scale and the extreme nature of the suffering. And that meant that taxpayers wanted their governments to provide some relief to the suffering. The second factor is that donors, I think, were afraid of contagion, that problems would spread if they're not contained where they started. And the third factor, which was important, is that the aid agencies were largely able to convince the donors that most of their money was reaching people in need. And there was a lot of innovation, in fact, particularly in the cross-border operation, which proved to people and continues to prove to people that the money does get to people who need it. Some of the things we've done on the cross-border operation, which go way beyond what we've been able to do in terms of monitoring in parts of Syria under government control, we should replicate in other places around the world. And the last thing I want to touch on briefly is the question of sanctions. The government and its allies claim that sanctions are the main culprit for the humanitarian suffering and the sorry state of Syria's economy, and they accuse others of collective punishment. This has been one of the most contentious issues in the UN in New York in the last couple of years or so, and the debate enjoys a great deal more heat than light. But there are some things I think that are clear enough. I mean, firstly, the tendency of the Syrian authorities to ascribe to sanctions all the problems they face and to claim that the underlying intent is to maximize the suffering endured by their people is not to be taken seriously. I mean, for one thing, it rather glosses over the impact of the decade of war, glosses over the government's own corruption, mismanagement, the economic and health impact of COVID, the effect on Syria of the Lebanese banking crisis. And for another thing, Why would the West be providing billions of dollars a year in life-saving aid if their goal is to maximize the suffering of the ordinary people? Equally, though, the point of the sanctions is to harm someone. And the issue is whether those imposing sanctions are penalizing the people they want to penalize. And the truth is, it's difficult to disentangle the socioeconomic and humanitarian impact of sanctions from other war-related and economic factors. But one thing we do know from elsewhere, notably Somalia, is that sanctions can complicate the delivery of humanitarian assistance in ways those imposing them say they don't want. And that's particularly true for NGOs who don't benefit from the same immunities and exemptions as the UN. And there are real issues to be addressed about whether the sanctions in fact constrain the humanitarian operation, which those who have imposed them are duty bound to take seriously and mitigate and deal with, in my opinion. I'm afraid, looking at the situation today in Syria, it is difficult to be optimistic. There is a lull in the fighting, but the suffering of the population probably is greater than ever because of the poverty and hunger. And the political process is not going well, as my colleague Pedersen said yesterday. Ultimately, the only way out of this tragedy is through politics and some kind of agreement. The leading powers have a responsibility to play a stronger role in that, but it's not happening yet. Mahmoud, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for this history of the past 10 years, the details and the comprehensive overview. And thank you as well for the different lessons learned, or rather the takeaways from your own experience. This was very interesting for us to sort of learn and have a sense of the kind of issues that are coming now to the fore for you at the tail end of this experience. We're going now to turn to the question and answer period. I see that some questions are coming already. I would like to ask the kind colleagues to post them as we indicated on the Q&A, and I will return to them in a moment. Let me just start actually with a question of mine to you briefly. I wanted actually to start where you've just left it, about the current situation, and link that to something you said earlier, which I think is very true for many observers, which is what you call the failure of politics in this particular history. I think we can go back very early on to the hopes that had been pinned on what the late Kofi Annan was trying to do, and we really haven't seen much progress diplomatically, in fact, over the past couple of years since that particular moment. One could even argue that it's been going down since then in different ways. But if we had to sort of really question that particular sequence that started there, what could have been done differently? You spoke of the inability of the major powers to really kind of, walk the walk, as they say, and to go beyond simply these professions of and indications of engagement. Was there anything else that at that stage, and of course, the responsibility of the Syrian government and the Syrian state and Mr. Assad himself is obvious. It's the starting and ending point of the story. But on those politics internationally, what could have been done differently?
Well, I think the prime responsibility you have to say before getting into this question is with the Syrian parties, and above all with the government. Now, others can play a role in exercising influence over them because they are reliant on external support. And I think it's the case that were 4 countries able to agree some kind of way to move forward, the Russian Federation, Iran, Turkey, and the US, probably it would be possible to make more progress than is happening at the moment. I mean, that said, more than 30 countries have military forces of one sort or another deployed in the Syria theatre over the last 10 years. There have been people from more than 100 countries who have held a gun in Syria over the last 10 years. And that is one of the huge complications of this. It's genuinely an internationalized problem. happening at a time when the leading powers are finding it more difficult than they did, say, between about 1990 and 2005 to prevent and resolve conflicts. So in a way, what we've seen in Syria is a commentary on the wider state of geopolitics.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have a lot of questions coming in, so let me start with those. We have two of them addressing the same issue, so I'll blend them. One of the obvious casualties, which you mentioned, is IHL itself. This is my comment before the question, obviously in the lack of respect for the rules of war and so on. But the other casualty, and this is what two colleagues are mentioning, is the whole question, of course, of R2P, responsibility to protect. Can you speak to that? Because there was so much hope pinned exactly on that in that phase, and Libya comes in the middle of this, of course. But what happens with R2P in the sequence?
Well, R2P was a creature of an era when there was more collaboration between the leading powers, and there was one overwhelming superpower. R2P essentially is a casualty of the evolution of geopolitics, because some of the leading powers have decided that the cost of standing up to R2P would be too high. And of course, that comes partly in the wake of, you know, the Iraq war, of the experience of Afghanistan, and after a period where there were a few quite small, relatively speaking, small problems which were involved through intervention, like in Sierra Leone and one or two other places, there's been an extended period of unsuccessful attempts to intervene to resolve problems satisfactorily. And that has chilled the commitment to R2P, I think. So R2P is a creature of a different era.
Just pushing that briefly, can it still be saved, quote unquote? Can it still be brought back in the sequence, or have we moved on?
Well, I think it depends on how collaboration between the different group of leading powers evolves in the period ahead. But I think R2P, I mean, clearly it bumps into some core principles that some important states hold very dear, like the principle of non-interference and sovereignty. And by definition, R2P invites a putting to one side for a moment of those principles. So I think, you know, something would have to change before you would see other manifestations of the practical manifestation of the use of the responsibility to protect principle.
Thank you very much, Mark. One question here is about something you mentioned, and you indicated the availability to go back to. Can you touch upon some of the conversations you had with the Syrian refugees?
Yes. I mean, one thing I should say is that I haven't actually been able to visit Syria since late 2018, because the government of Syria, who've been cross with some of the things I thought it was my job to say in the Security Council, made it clear they wouldn't give me a visa. So often when I talk to Syrians inside Syria, it is on the video link. But I've continued to travel to the neighboring countries and met lots of Syrians there. And as I say, I do talk to Syrians inside the country on the video link. And I don't always publicize those conversations for obvious reasons. One set of conversations I do remember very well was I had a first conversation in July 2019 with Dr. Mohamedou, who's a surgeon at Idlib Central Hospital. And as he and I were speaking, he was tending to a 9-year-old girl whose name was Dahlia, who'd been brought to his hospital 2 days previously because their house had been hit by a bomb dropped by a warplane. she came with her 2 younger sisters in an emergency ambulance. Their mother and their 5-year-old sister were killed in the attack. And one of the children, the 3-year-old Rawan, had grabbed the T-shirt of her baby sister in a desperate attempt to stop the baby falling off the precipice that the bomb had made of the upper stories of their house. Rawan, the 3-year-old, died sadly of her injuries the day after the attack. But I was talking to Dr. Mohammed while he was tending to Dahlia, and I asked him if he had a message for the world, and I relayed his message to the Security Council, and his message was the same message I've heard multiple times from many Syrians. We are afraid. Please help us. Make it stop. That's the thing Syrians say time and time again. Sometimes there have been pictures or stories which have captured the world's attention and have at various moments tried, not fully successfully so far, to harvest a different approach. Lots of people remember the picture of Aylan Kurdi, that little boy who drowned when his family were trying to escape the region, and there were pictures of his limp little body being held by someone rescuing him from the sea. And sometimes those pictures have captured people's human spirit, and there has been an attempt to generate a reaction and cause something to be done. But so far, those human reactions haven't been sufficient to resolve the underlying issues. And the infuriating thing is the men with the guns and bombs seem not to be moved at all by these stories of human tragedy.
And precisely to this, and linking 2 aspects of what you were discussing, a 2-part question from a colleague. The second part of her question is, as a humanitarian worker, what do you think are the 2 emotions that move humanitarian action today? And the first part is, you mentioned the politicization and instrumentalization of humanitarian aid. Do you think that the humanitarian action that has occurred in Syria for the past decade has displayed imperial and racial behavior?
Well, I think the main thing that I observe is compassion and humanity. That is the main thing that motivates humanitarian workers, whether they are, as I say, in Syria. Most humanitarian workers have been Syrian, working for multiple different organizations, including the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, including lots of other NGOs, and people working for those organizations display enormous courage and humanity. And I don't think any of that can be described as colonial or racially motivated. I think that is about our common humanity. As I said earlier, I think there are also some other motivations out there. I think that some countries providing assistance genuinely want to avoid problems spreading and avoid contagion, and that certainly is a factor. But I think I do genuinely think the main thing motivating people's contribution to humanitarian goals is a sense of shared humanity. Maybe Mahmoud, because I do this for a living and I've done it for a long time, and because I don't think you keep doing this kind of work unless you can sustain a belief in our common humanity. Maybe I would say that, wouldn't I? But that honestly is what it looks like to me.
Thank you very much. This is also something you mentioned earlier, which is of great interest to many colleagues, this question of sanctions. And so the colleague asked, do you think that the UN sufficiently forecast the impact of sanctions and its continuing impact on women and children in particular? And if so, these issues come enough before the Security Council? And what would be, the way to mitigate the impact? I should mention, for instance, that in the regional context you mentioned, a neighboring country like Iraq, for instance, suffered that extensively. With the numbers are staggering here too, if we recall the UNICEF report about the children in Iraq back in the 90s. Is this notion, addressed sufficiently, as the colleague writes?
The central problem in analysing the sanctions issue, really, in my opinion, as I've said, is it's very everybody who gets into it comes at it from a point of view rather than from a desire genuinely to analyse and understand the issues and see what the relative impact of different problems is in adding to people's suffering. I also should be clear that my office and I don't actually have a mandate to analyse sanctions issues, and beyond that, we certainly don't have the capacity. We don't have the analytical resources or the the group of skilled people who would be able to disentangle all the different factors. But in the case of Syria, I go back basically to the 2 points I made earlier. The first point, in summary, is that it's not plausible to say that sanctions are the main reason for Syria being in the state it's in. I don't think that stacks up. The second point, though, is that sanctions are intended to hurt somebody. That's the whole point of sanctions. And the question for those imposing them is, are you sure the people you're trying to hurt are the people who are in fact paying the biggest price of this?
Thank you very much. A question on the diplomatic aspect of this humanitarian work. Did the peace talks in Geneva and Astana deal at all with the humanitarian action aspect? And were you able to be present at these talks, or anyone from your team?
Well, obviously the UN's mediated talks are led by my colleague, Geir Pedersen. And in fact, his office for some years now has had a humanitarian task force which has tried to help deal with various aspects of the humanitarian crisis and get some agreement, in particular from the leading external powers, on what can be done. The Sochi Astana process, the UN, I've never myself been involved in meetings when those three countries have got together. The UN sometimes has been in town at the same time. I think there have been sort of indirect humanitarian dimensions of those talks when, for example, buffer zones have been created. And one of the goals of those has been to relieve the humanitarian suffering. But often there's been a sort of wider agenda there, often of a sort of political insecurity nature. Now, I'm obviously in favour of progress on the political side, because that is what sustains people's suffering. The absence of that progress is what's sustaining suffering. But other parts of the UN have had much more involvement in those dimensions of the Syria crisis than the humanitarian agencies have done directly.
Excellent, Mark. We have a lot of questions. I'll try to field as much as possible in the next 10 minutes or so. Sort of building from that to sort of the logistical aspect and sort of the technical work that you do. A colleague is asking, could you please say a bit more about the state of planning for the possibility of non-renewal of the cross-border resolution? Any contingencies, implications for funding, coordination, access, procurement, all of these aspects, how do they really shape?
Yeah, well, the cross-border operation that we run at the moment basically covers the population of about 4 million people in northwestern Syria. An alternative to the cross-border operation would be to run convoys from Damascus to reach the needs of those people. And we've been trying to get agreement from all the parties to do that for more than a year. And we haven't made no progress on that. And in my opinion is that it's going to be very difficult to make progress, because I don't think either party really wants, if they're honest, large-scale convoys of that sort to run. They both pretend to, but in fact, in my opinion, neither of them really want that. And so if one side thinks the other side is going to agree a proposal, axiomatically, that side will decide there's something wrong with it. And we've seen this in other parts of Syria. We've seen it for 18 months now when it comes to trying to reach what's now quite a small population of people in Rukban in eastern Syria who've had no assistance for a long, long time and who are in terrible shape. But there's you know, number of people there is 10 or 20,000, not 4 million, as in the case in northwest Syria. So if you can't run cross-line support, the only way you can reach people is across the border from Turkey. And the UN will either be given permission to continue to do that by the Security Council, or we won't. If we won't, you know, the world will see the consequences. Turkey does provide its own assistance across the border. There's also some commercial traffic. But what the UN does, sending more than 1,000 trucks a week, 1,000 trucks a month across the border with huge volumes of food and shelter and other essential supplies, meets a very substantial proportion of total needs. So what does the world expect those people to do if that assistance is cut off? That is the issue that will be determined by the debate, which will need to be resolved by July on whether to extend the operation or not.
Thank you. Try to have as much as possible, and maybe we can get some quick answers, Mark, as you've been doing. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Building two in one about voices, some of them unheard and some of them heard maybe too much. One question is about essentially, have the UN agencies tried to incorporate the voice and perspective of Syrians into these policy-making processes at the Security Council? And separate but relatedly, I think, someone is asking, would you say there's another role for the press, the public opinion, beyond simply getting donations in the resolution of this conflict? These voices on the outside, obviously the Syrians are the primary actors, but they are kept on the outside of the process, at least as we can observe. What can you say about those two dimensions?
Well, the main protagonists for Syria are obviously the government and the leaders of the opposition group. I mean, that's just how these things get done in the world, isn't it? Because of the role that states have in the modern world. But they all need to think about their constituencies and their people. And probably none of them think enough about those constituencies and the issues they bring to the table. I think that professional journalists have played a very important role, not least in the provision of true factual information and the combating of lots of the fake news and lies that have been told. And journalists have displayed huge courage and determination in doing that. Many of them are Syrian, but many of them are international as well. This is a crisis that has been observed and scrutinized and studied and seen by the world much more than many other crises. And on the whole, that is a positive thing.
There's a question going back to the question of diplomacy, but specifically the multilateral aspects. Of course, in the picture you painted, there's many crises taking place simultaneously. Libya, we spoke, we haven't mentioned Yemen. Precisely the question does this. What does the crisis in Syria and Yemen and Afghanistan and the Central African Republic, we could add the Sahel, of course, tell us about the state of multilateralism today? Isn't it time to recognize that the UN is simply a symptom of some irrelevance today of that organization? And how can we have a sense of rebirth and hope for the organization?
Well, the UN is two things. It is a theatre in which the leading countries interact with each other and discuss things. And it's better to have that forum than not to have it, even when, as is the case at the moment, they can't agree on very much. It's still better to have the forum. The UN, though, is also an actor. The agencies, and particularly the humanitarian agencies, when they can be funded and when they get access, can do things which, at least to some degree, reduce the scale of suffering and loss of life. And I think it's important when people think about the UN that they have in their mind the distinction between being the theatre and being the actor, because those are different things. Often when people are criticizing the UN, what they're actually criticizing is the theatre, as opposed to what the agencies and the staff can do in their guise as an actor.
Thank you very much, Mark. I will finish with two questions, going back to our topic and going back to our forum. The question is about essentially, and I thank the colleague asking it for his or her patient, since it's been asked a while ago. It goes back to the heart of this question and the forecast for Syria itself. You have spoken, says the colleague, of the past history in the 90s, in particular of the Balkans region, with a potential effect, as we've heard a lot, of the Balkanizations of Syria. that could lead to this potential dispersion of the country in different territories represented by different populations, the Alawis and so on and so forth. But what has happened in the Balkans region is really different. Is this solution plausible and even wishable for Syria?
So I'm not the person who can offer a good comment on that. So I probably better not stray into that territory, because my colleagues in the political sphere have got much more expertise than I have. One way or another, there needs to be a polity in Syria where everyone can find their fair role, and Syrians from all backgrounds can live together more peaceably in future.
Excellent. And I should say these questions have been coming from all over the world. And so this one I will finish with comes from Brazil. And it goes back precisely to what we do here. So this is a potential student asking, or professional in the making, what advice would you give to a researcher or a student, a graduate student today researching the humanitarianism and development issues? What specific research puzzle should be sort of fit in this picture? And that would be the last question.
Well, that is, I mean, it's a very interesting question, a huge question actually, because the last 10 years has seen a huge explosion in humanitarian problems, not just in Syria, but manifested in its nastiest dimensions by what's happened in Syria. And so there's a huge number of topics that people could get into. I think, you know, one important topic is, how do we do better on dealing with the causes of these problems? A second topic is, given the way that belligerents and stakeholders in fact are behaving, never mind how they ought to behave, given the way they are in fact behaving, how do we organize a humanitarian response and a humanitarian system to mitigate the suffering of people caught up through no fault of their own in these crises?
Thank you very much, Mark. This is very much what I think will echo with some mindsets that we have here at the Institute. We try to get a way of understanding these issues, but also there is this engagement dimension. This is exactly the hour mark. This is the Graduate Institute of Geneva, so we have to keep to the 60 minutes that we have. I want to thank you very much, Mark, for this very rich and insightful conversation, for sharing your thoughts and in a very intimate way, and that was extremely helpful, as well as going back to the past 10 years and how this whole sequence has played out. So many thanks for that, and I would like to thank all of the colleagues who turned up and provided excellent comments and questions, helping nourish this conversation. So with that, we come to the close. So many thanks, Mark, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Mohamedou. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening or a good morning wherever you are. Thank you.